I was lucky enough to grow up in a church, like Olivia will grow up in a church. And when I think about my earliest memories in church, a lot of them center around Sunday school. And there's one particular thing that stands out, this game we always used to play in Sunday school, where you all stood on one side of the room and you had to answer these Bible trivia questions to be able to take a step forward, and you wanted to be the first one across the room to get the prize. This game stands out to me because I was so atrocious at it. I went to Sunday school every week, but for whatever reason, all the names and the places and the details, they never stuck in my memory. So whenever it was my turn, I would always draw a complete blank. And I felt like such a loser to always come in last place. And so this game filled me with anxiety whenever I knew we were going to play it. But there was one time, the first and the last time, that I managed to win this game. And so that stands out in my memory too. The question that got me over the edge was, can you name any of the disciples? And for every disciple I could get right, I could take one step forward. Now, I couldn't have told you the story of doubting Thomas. I couldn't have told you that the name Peter had anything to do with the word rock. I had no idea that any of the disciples had a history in the fishing industry. But I remember being a little girl and asking why all the boys in my family and in my neighborhood and in my church had the same dozen names. Where was the creativity? And I remember someone explaining to me, well, these names are in the Bible. They're names of Jesus' disciples, and so families gave them to their sons and passed them down through the generations, and that's why you have 5 Jameses in your immediate family. And so I remembered that, and so when my teacher asked this question, my hand shot up, and I just listed off every boy's name I could think of. And I got some wrong. There's no disciple Seamus, there's no disciple Martin, but I got to take enough steps forward that I won the game. Memory, what we remember and who we remember, sometimes it's arbitrary. But I think for us as people of faith, it's important. Because what and who we remember, it shapes who we are. And that's what I want us to think about this morning. Will you pray with me? Holy God, we feel your Spirit always and already moving in this space. But we ask your particular blessing on the moments ahead, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing in your sight. Amen. Today, we continue through the Acts of the Apostles, which is a story of the early church, the very, very early days of Jesus' movement, when no one would have called it a church, when people involved never would have imagined that what they were doing would one day be considered separate from Judaism. This is the early days of the Jesus movement, and we get this tiny little story, 7 sentences long, about a woman named Tabitha. Tabitha is dead by the time our story opens, and she remains dead until the last 12 words or so. And yet, we learn a lot about this woman named Tabitha in these few sentences. One of the first things we learn about her is that she is called a disciple. Acts introduces us to Tabitha as a disciple. And I just want to spend a minute focusing on that because I know that my 9-year-old self never would have named Tabitha as a disciple. And I know that if I did, my teacher would have looked at me like I was crazy and wouldn't have had any idea who I was talking about. Some disciples we remember, and some we don't. It says something about who we have been as a church. Tabitha is introduced to us as a disciple, which means that she was considered a leader in her community, that she had wisdom and experience in practice that made people look to her to figure out what this Jesus movement was all about, how to follow Christ every day. We meet Tabitha and we learn that she is a disciple. We learn more about her than that. We learn that she's also called Dorcas. Tabitha is an Aramaic name, a language that was used in the Jewish community. Dorcas is a Greek name. At this point in the early church, the relationships between Christians or Jesus followers who were Jews and those who were Gentiles were fraught. The community hadn't decided what it would look like for people who weren't circumcised, who didn't follow Jewish law, to go and join the church and follow Jesus. They weren't sure if there was a place for Gentiles, for Greeks among them. It was something that was still debated. But we learned that this disciple, Tabitha, was enough immersed in the Greek community, was in relationship with Gentiles, so much so that she had a Greek name. And so we learned that she was a bridger of boundaries. She was someone who reached out and welcomed those that other people weren't quite sure if they belonged. We notice that Tabitha is a disciple, that she's a bridger of boundaries. We also learn that she cares for those who are vulnerable. Acts tells us that she has works of charity. And Acts also shows us the people who came to mourn her when she was gone, widows who poured into that upper room, carrying the pieces of clothing that she had made for them. Widows, especially in the ancient world, were an incredibly vulnerable class of people, unable in most settings to inherit property, unable in most settings to earn themselves a living. Widows lived on the margins of society and were often dependent on others to make ends meet. And Tabitha was one of those people who stepped up and put her money and her body and her time on the line, doing the incredibly strenuous work of weaving clothing to help give these widows a life and a livelihood. So Tabitha was an incredible woman. And it shouldn't come as a surprise then that when she dies, the community feels broken. They feel so broken that they reach out to a leader in the way who is a few towns over, and they ask him to come and be present. They call for Peter, and Peter comes. Travel in the ancient world was often on foot. It was no easy process. It was a journey of maybe 10 miles, but he makes it to come and be present for the mourning of Tabitha. He comes into that upper room. He sees the widows gathered, showing the tunics that she has made. He hears the stories about Tabitha, about her life and her legacy. And then, much the way Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke, he sends the people out. He speaks words that Jesus spoke and says, "Tabitha, get up." And she stands. And he shows her to the people, and they rejoice, and many come to faith because of this miracle. For 6 sentences, there is a lot packed into this story of Tabitha. And I wonder when I read this story why they called Peter in the first place. Did they call Peter because they expected him to raise Tabitha from the dead? Perhaps they did. But when Peter raises Tabitha, that's the first time in Jesus' story that anyone besides Jesus is capable of raising someone from the dead. So I'm not sure if that could have been an expectation. I wonder if maybe part of why they called Peter is because they wanted him to know her. They had just lost this leader in their community. They missed her bitterly, and they wanted to protect her story, her legacy, and make sure that it would live on. And so they called this leader, Peter, who traveled from church to church thinking, if Peter knows who Tabitha is, maybe he'll tell other churches. Maybe her story will live on. She'll be remembered for the person that she is. Stories matter. The way we share them, the way we tell them matters. Today, many of us celebrate Mother's Day. For me, Mother's Day is often a lot about stories and telling stories. I am lucky. I have and have had so many amazing mother figures in my life. From my own mom to grandmothers, godmothers, aunts, older sister figures and camp counselors, mentors and teachers. I've had love poured in on me from so many women. But there are other mothers in my life who I never got to meet, who have still shaped who I am and the life I live. I think about Walter's Oma, who I never got to meet, who died before we got together. But I feel like I know her because I see her in Walter's love of reading, I see her in his love of travel, because she took him abroad when he was just a little boy. I see her in all the German traditions and jokes his family tells that go right over my head. I never met my dad's grandmother, but I've heard the stories about how she would always have warm snickerdoodles on the table in the time before GPS or cell phones, the second my dad and his family pulled in the driveway from their 4-hour trip. And so I've never met her, but I make that dough in bulk, and I keep it rolled in my freezer so it's ready if any last-minute guests show up. And I never met my mom's grandmother either, but I've heard the stories about how she lost her dad and her son and her husband within a matter of months, and how she stepped up and took over the family business, and how what she wanted most in the world for her granddaughters, for my mom and for my aunt, was the college education that she never had. How she worked hard to make that possible, how I owe so much of my life to that hard work. The wisdom that these women embodied, the prayers that they prayed, they go with me wherever I go. As you all probably can guess, I'm Protestant. And yet, the second I lose something, in my head comes this little prayer, St. Anthony, look around, something has been lost and that can't be found. In this congregational church, I'm seeing a lot of nods about this St. Anthony prayer. Whenever I'm down on myself, mired in perfectionism, I can see the face of my great-grandmother, a face I've only actually ever seen in photographs, and I can hear her voice saying, "Kayla, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." My children will never meet my grandmothers, who have long since passed, but I know that they will grow up surrounded in the stories, in the practices, in the traditions of these women, and so they will know them. I'm sure there are people who Olivia didn't get to meet. And I'm sure that fills us with grief when we hold a little one in our arms and wish that the whole family, those departed saints, could hold them too. But the love that will be poured in on Olivia every day of her life was shaped by those people. And so, in that way, she will know them. What we remember, who we remember, the stories we tell, they shape who we are and what we become. I think of that psalm that we read together. The Dover Church had a tradition of reading that psalm every single Sunday. And generations who went through Sunday school before me would have struggled to make it to confirmation class without knowing that psalm by heart. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. We don't do that kind of memorization in Sunday school anymore, but sometimes I wonder what it means to know by heart these words of promise that speak of a God who offers protection, who abides with you, whose love is as fierce and as never-ending as a mother. And I think of the story of Tabitha, this disciple who is hardly ever remembered, and I wonder what it would mean for us as individuals and for us as a church if we remembered that story and if we told it. This story of Tabitha, it reminds us that the people we remember and how we remember, that the legacies that we carry on, they shape who we are. It reminds us that we have a choice about what stories we tell our children. We have a choice about what we want to be remembered for. We have a choice about what and who we honor and who we celebrate. And this story about Tabitha reminds us that a legacy of offering welcome when other people shy away, a legacy of caring for the most vulnerable. Work, by the way, that's often unpaid and unglamorous, that's often done by mothers. This story reminds us that that kind of legacy is enough to be remembered for, that that kind of legacy is enough to earn someone the title of a disciple. It's definitely something that seems worth remembering to me. Amen.